That money was just sitting there. My mother said it the way you'd mention the weather, not defending herself, not even aware she needed to. I was standing in my sister's backyard with a paper plate of cake going soft in my hand when she said it, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. I understood in that second that the woman who raised me did not think she had done anything wrong at all. I want to back up before I tell you what she'd actually done, because you need to understand what that account was before you can understand what it meant to lose it. My name is Dana. I grew up in Renwick, Indiana, a town built around a foundry that stopped pouring iron before I finished high school. My father, Raymond, worked the line there for 18 years. He was the kind of man who checked the oil in your car without being asked, and never once raised his voice at the dinner table. I was 11 when a chain failed on a lift at the foundry and he didn't come home. I remember the 2 men from his shift standing on our porch in their work boots, holding their hats. And I remember my mother's hand going wide around the doorframe before either of them said a word. The insurance paid out $60,000. My mother took me to the bank that spring. A woman behind a desk explained that the account would be opened in both our names, mine and my mother's, since I was still a minor and someone needed to sign for me. Nobody ever mentioned coming back to change that once I turned 18. I certainly didn't think to ask. You don't think about paperwork when you're 11 and your father is gone. You think about the smell of his jacket still hanging by the door, and how long you're allowed to leave it there before somebody moves it. That account became something we just called Dana's savings. The way a family calls a drawer the junk drawer without anyone deciding it. Every birthday, a little more went in. Every summer job in high school, I'd walk to that same branch and add what I'd earned, scooping ice cream or ringing up hardware at the register. When my grandmother died, her small inheritance went in too. 23 years of a little at a time, sitting in an account with 2 names on it, growing the way something grows when you never touch it. By the year all of this happened, it was over $100,000. I never once thought to ask my mother to take her name off it. Why would I? It was hers as much as mine on paper and mine in every other way that mattered. My sister, Whitney, is 5 years younger than me. When she was 16, a truck ran a light on the county road and put her through 6 weeks in a brace and a limp she still has on cold mornings. Whitney became the daughter who'd almost been lost. I became the daughter who was fine, who could be counted on to keep being fine so nobody had to worry about 2 of us at once. I never resented her for the accident. I resented the arithmetic that came after it. The quiet math where Whitney's needs got counted twice and mine got counted once. If at all. I went into banking, of all things, because I was good with the one thing my family had never once been careful with around me. I became a senior loan underwriter at First Renwick Trust, the kind of job where strangers hand you their whole financial life and trust you to read it honestly. I was careful with everyone's numbers but my own. I trusted my mother with that account the exact same way I trusted the ground to hold me when I walked across it, not because I'd tested it, because I'd never once had a reason to imagine it wouldn't. That is the last morning I can tell you about where I still believed that. Because by the time the cake had gone soft on my paper plate in my sister's backyard, that ground was already gone. And I just hadn't looked down yet. The bridal shower was at my aunt's house, the kind of gathering with paper streamers taped to the porch rail and a table of gifts wrapped in white and gold. Whitney sat in the middle of it in a chair someone had decorated with ribbon, opening boxes of towels and blenders, while a dozen women I'd known my whole life took pictures on their phones. I'd brought a gift already, a set of luggage she'd mentioned wanting for the honeymoon, but standing there watching the pile grow, I decided on impulse to add something bigger. A weekend at the resort she and her fiancé kept talking about. The kind of thing you don't buy without checking a number first. I opened my banking app right there on the porch steps, half listening to someone unwrap a waffle iron behind me. I wasn't worried. I never had to be worried about that account. It was the one thing in my life that had simply always been there. Quiet and solid. The way a foundation is quiet and solid until the day you actually need to stand on it. The number on the screen read $0.00. I looked at it the way you look at a word that's spelled wrong, like my eyes had to be doing something incorrectly. I refreshed the app. The number didn't change. I scrolled up, looking for some other account I might have confused it with. There was only the same account number I'd known since I was 11, sitting empty in a way it had never once been empty in 23 years. I want to tell you I felt panic. What I actually felt was the cold clarity that comes from doing this exact job for a living. I know what my own face is supposed to do when a number doesn't add up. I kept it doing that now, on my aunt's porch, in front of a table of gift bags, steady, unbothered. My mother was watching me from across the yard. She must have seen something anyway, some flicker I couldn't fully manage. She set down her lemonade and crossed the grass toward me with the energy of someone who intends to get ahead of a conversation before it starts. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said, loud enough that a few heads turned, because my mother has never once said anything to me privately that could be said in front of an audience instead. I told her I was fine. I was already deciding, in that half-second, not to have this conversation on a lawn full of her friends. She didn't let it go. "Is this about the account?" she asked, and something in her voice had already shifted from concern to explanation, the tone of someone who has rehearsed this. That money was just sitting there. Dana, it wasn't doing anything. Your sister actually needed it for her honeymoon. She said it the way you'd explain why you moved a couch. Not an apology, not even close to one. A woman telling me the weather had changed and expecting me to nod along the way I always had. Somebody nearby laughed at something else entirely. A whole party going on around a hole that had just opened at my feet. I looked past my mother at Whitney, still in her ribboned chair, with no idea her sister was standing 40 feet away learning where $100,000 of her childhood had gone. I finished my cake. I don't know why that's the detail I remember most clearly, but I do. I stood there and ate it in small bites while my mother watched me for a reaction she wasn't getting. When the plate was empty, I told her congratulations were in order for Whitney, and I meant it, because none of this was my sister's doing. Not yet, not that I knew. I drove home with both hands steady on the wheel. I let myself into my apartment, set my bag down by the door the way I always did, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open before I'd even taken off my coat. Whatever my mother thought that money had bought her, I intended to know exactly what had happened to every dollar of it before I said another word to anyone. I have pulled apart other people's finances for a living long enough to know that a real emergency looks a certain way on paper. One big withdrawal. A panicked timestamp. A number that doesn't match anything that came before it. What I found in my own account looked nothing like that, and it took me most of that night to understand why the difference mattered so much. The money hadn't left in one motion. It had left in 11 separate withdrawals over 8 months, each one under $10,000, each one small enough on its own to look like nothing. A transfer here for what the memo line called wedding deposit, another for venue, another with no memo at all. Spread out that carefully, spaced that evenly. It wasn't a woman panicking under pressure. It was someone who understood exactly how a bank flags large transactions and had built a plan around staying just beneath that line. I sat with my cold coffee and thought back through the last 8 months, looking for the moments I must have walked right past without seeing them. My mother mentioning, almost in passing, that wedding costs had gotten out of hand. My mother saying Whitney deserved something special after everything she's been through, a phrase I had heard my whole life and never once questioned. It was true. And questioning it had always felt like something you weren't allowed to do in my family. I had heard every one of those comments as small talk. They had been receipts. The next morning, before my shift, I called the branch where the account had actually been opened, not the one where I worked, because I wasn't ready to explain any of this to a coworker yet. I asked the woman on the phone to confirm one thing for me in the flattest voice I could manage. Whether the account was still listed as a joint account, both names with equal standing, or whether at some point it had converted to something else once I became an adult. She told me exactly what I already suspected, in the patient tone of someone reading off a screen. Joint account, both parties full owners. No custodial restriction on file, no date of conversion. Nothing had ever changed since the day it was opened. My mother had never needed to forge a signature or sneak past a lock. She had simply used a door that had been standing wide open for 23 years, because nobody, including me, had ever once thought to close it. I want to tell you that knowing the mechanics made it hurt less. It didn't. If anything, it hurt in a different place. A single, desperate withdrawal. I might have been able to build a story around. A mother cornered, panicking, reaching for the nearest thing. What I actually had was evidence of patience. Someone who had looked at $100,000 sitting quietly in her daughter's name and decided, over the better part of a year, exactly how to take it. Slow enough that no one would notice until it was already gone. That was the moment the shock in me started turning into something colder and more useful. Not because the money mattered less than I'd first felt it did. Standing on that porch, it mattered exactly as much. But I stopped waiting for an apology sometime around 2 a.m, sitting at my own kitchen table with the same kind of notebook my whole family had grown up watching my father keep. I understood, finally, that I wasn't looking at a mistake that had happened to me. I was looking at a system that had always been capable of this, quietly, the whole time, and had simply never had a reason to show itself until my sister needed a honeymoon. I closed the laptop a little after 3. I didn't cry, and I didn't call my mother to ask why. I had spent my whole adult life reading other people's numbers and telling them gently what those numbers actually meant about their choices. It was time I did the same thing for my own family, whether they wanted to hear it or not, and I already had a fairly good idea of where I intended to start. I took my morning off and drove to the branch myself, the one on 4th Street with the brick front and the flag that never comes down even in wind. I sat across from a manager named Curtis, someone I'd worked alongside on a mortgage file 2 years earlier. I told him what I needed. Remove my mother as a joint owner on the savings account. Leave my name, and only my name, on everything going forward. He pulled the account up and read the ownership terms out loud, more for form than because either of us doubted it. Both parties full owners, equal standing, either one able to remove the other without the other's consent. Once both were adults with valid identification. I had the identification. I had been an adult for 16 years. Curtis didn't ask me why. People in this job learn not to ask why. The same way I've learned not to ask a client why their marriage is ending when they come in to split a mortgage. He printed the forms. I signed where the small arrows told me to sign, and by early afternoon it was done. One name where there used to be 2. I didn't call my mother to tell her. I didn't need to. I knew exactly how she'd find out. I'd built systems like this one for other people's parents 100 times, and I knew what the software would do the moment she tried to use an account that no longer recognized her. It happened 3 days later. I know the details because Whitney told me afterward, in the flat voice of someone repeating something she still didn't fully understand. My mother had gone to put a deposit down on centerpieces for the reception, using an app she'd used 100 times before without a second thought. And the screen had simply refused her. Access denied, no further explanation, the way the bank's systems are built to give none, because that is exactly what I would have told Curtis to do if a client had asked me to word it. She called me within the hour. I let it ring twice before I picked up. The same 2 rings I imagined she once made someone else sit through. Though I didn't know that story yet. "What did you do?" she said. No hello. Her voice had a pitch to it I hadn't heard directed at me before, somewhere between fury and disbelief. Like the ground had done something to her personally, instead of simply doing what it had always been capable of doing. "You embarrassed me." Do you have any idea how this looks? 3 weeks before your sister's wedding, I let a silence sit there long enough that she had to keep talking into it. "That account has always been for this family," she said. "You had no right. I asked her one question, the only one I actually wanted answered. What exactly she thought my name on that account had been worth to her. Not the round number, the exact figure, to the dollar, that she felt entitled to take without asking. She didn't answer that. She told me I was twisting things, that I was punishing her for wanting a beautiful day for my sister, that I had always had a coldness in me nobody else in the family had. I let her get all the way through it. Then I told her I hoped Whitney's honeymoon was everything she'd been promised, because it had cost more than she knew, and I hung up first. That was the part, I'd learn later, that she couldn't forgive, not the account, the hanging up. My mother has never once in her life been the one left holding a silent phone. I had just handed her that silence on purpose, the same silence she'd handed me for most of my childhood without ever once noticing she was doing it. I sat at my kitchen table after that call and didn't feel triumphant. I felt like someone who had just closed a door that had been open, unguarded, for 23 years. Only now, in the quiet afterward, did I start to understand how much colder the house had always been on the other side of it. Renwick is small enough that news travels faster than the people it's about. By that Sunday, my aunt had already called to tell me I ought to be ashamed of myself, embarrassing my mother right before a wedding. I let her finish and told her I hoped she'd enjoyed the centerpieces, and I hung up, the way I was apparently learning to do now. Whitney's text came later that same night, and it wasn't the message I expected from her. I'd braced myself for her to take our mother's side outright, the way she'd been raised to, the way I think I might have too in her position. Instead, what came through was smaller and more uncertain than that. "Mom said you two had an agreement about that account," she wrote. "Is that true? I read it 3 times before I answered." An agreement. That was the word my mother had chosen, and I understood immediately what it was doing. Softening a theft into something that sounded mutual, something I'd apparently signed off on and was now, unreasonably, going back on. I typed out a long answer and deleted it. What I sent instead was short. "No, I found out the same way you're finding out things now. Ask her what the withdrawals were labeled." I didn't hear back that night, and I told myself that meant nothing yet. I saw Marcus for the first time since all of this started 2 days later, at a small gathering at my aunt's to go over seating charts. It was the kind of obligation I still hadn't figured out how to skip without making it a bigger event than it needed to be. Whitney's fiancé is a quiet man by nature, a maintenance tech at the packaging plant off Route 9, the sort who fixes things without being asked and doesn't say much while he does it. I'd always liked him for that. That afternoon, though, the quiet had a different texture to it. He was standing near the drink table when I came in, and for just a second, before he caught himself, he looked at me the way you look at someone you're about to say something to and then don't. His hand tightened around his cup. He glanced toward the kitchen, where I could hear my mother's voice explaining the seating arrangement to someone. It was the particular bright tone she uses when she wants a room to believe everything is fine. Then he looked back at me and gave a small nod, not really a greeting, more an acknowledgement that something existed between us that neither of us was going to name out loud in that room. "Dana," he said, and nothing else. And somehow that single word carried more weight than a whole sentence would have. I asked him how the wedding planning was going. The safe, ordinary question you ask when you don't yet know what else there is to ask. He said it was going fine, a beat too quickly, his eyes flicking once more toward the kitchen before he found something urgent to say to my uncle about the grill. I stood there for a second longer than the moment called for, turning over what I'd just seen. I have interviewed enough people across a desk to recognize the specific posture of someone carrying a fact they haven't decided what to do with yet. Marcus had it, plain as a stain on a shirt he was hoping nobody would look at directly. Whatever it wasn't nothing. I found myself, on the drive home that night, thinking less about my mother for the first time in days. and more about what a quiet, careful man might know that he hadn't found a way to say. I thought about it again the next morning. Over coffee, I let go cold at the kitchen table. And again on my lunch break, staring at a spreadsheet that wasn't mine to be distracted from. There was a version of this where Marcus knew nothing at all, where I'd read too much into a man who simply didn't enjoy family gatherings. I didn't believe that version. I've spent too many years reading the difference between a person who's uncomfortable and a person who's hiding something specific. And his eyes hadn't done the first thing, they'd done the second. To understand what happened next, you need to go back 6 years, to a winter I hadn't thought much about in a long time until it suddenly mattered again. My mother had lost her part-time position as a teacher's aide at the elementary school that fall, one of a handful of cuts the district made when enrollment dropped. The house payment on the place I grew up in, the place my father had died to keep paid off, suddenly didn't fit inside what she brought home anymore. She needed to refinance to get the payment down to something survivable on a fixed income, and the bank told her, not unkindly, that her numbers alone wouldn't support the loan. They needed a guarantor, someone with steady income who'd stand behind the note if she ever fell short. I had just made senior underwriter that year. I remember sitting across a different desk than the one I usually sat behind, on the other side of the table for once. I signed my name under a heading that said Guarantor in bold type, and felt something close to pride about it. This was what a good daughter did. This was the whole shape of the life I'd built, finally useful for something that mattered, what I hadn't paid close enough attention to. Because I trusted the bank the way I trusted my own family, was a single clause buried on page 4. The guarantee required annual renewal. Every year, on the anniversary of the refinance, I would need to sign a new form confirming I still stood behind the loan. If I ever declined to sign, the bank had the right to require my mother to requalify on her own income within 30 days. Miss that window, and the loan would move into a higher risk category with terms that could change fast. For 6 years, I signed that renewal without reading past the first line. It came in the mail every spring, a plain envelope from the bank. I'd sit at my kitchen table and sign it the way you'd sign a birthday card, out of the same reflex that had kept me feeding a joint account for 2 decades. I never once considered what it would mean to simply not sign. This year's envelope had been sitting on my counter for 2 weeks by the time the bridal shower happened. I'd meant to get to it. I always meant to get to it. I just kept setting it down again, the way you set down a chore that doesn't have a deadline attached to it yet, and going back to whatever felt more urgent that day. After the shower, after the account, after the phone call where I asked her what my name on that account had been worth to her. That envelope looked different every time I walked past it. It sat there on my way to the coffee maker like it was waiting for something. It wasn't a chore anymore. It was a question I hadn't decided how to answer, sitting in plain sight on my own counter. Some nights I'd stand there with my coffee going cold and just look at it, turning the same 6 years over in my mind. All the times I'd signed without asking anything of her in return. All the times that it apparently meant nothing when it came time for her to decide who deserved $100,000 more than I did. I didn't open it yet. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't ready to make that decision out of anger. Some part of me, the part that had spent 34 years being the responsible one, still wanted a good enough reason before I let 6 years of habit go. Anger felt too easy a thing to build a decision like that on, and too easy a thing for her to dismiss later as a tantrum. I got that reason 2 days later, from someone I hadn't expected to be the one to hand it to me. Marcus texted me on a Tuesday afternoon, a message with no small talk in it at all. Can we talk? Not at a family thing, just us. I read it twice in the break room at work, and told him I could meet after my shift, at the coffee place off Route 9 near his job. Somewhere neither family would think to walk in. He was already in a back booth when I got there, both hands wrapped around a cup he wasn't drinking from. A phone sat face down on the table in front of him, like he hadn't decided yet whether he was really going to turn it over. "I helped Whitney book the honeymoon," he said, before I'd even sat down all the way. "Back in the spring. She asked me to look at flights on my lunch break because her computer at work was locked down. I was logged into her email to compare fares, and a message came in while I was in there. From your mom." He turned the phone over then and slid it across the table. I read it standing still on the inside, the way you go still when you're bracing for something you already suspect is going to be worse than you're ready for. It was a thread between my mother and Whitney, dated months before the shower, months before I'd noticed a single withdrawal. My mother had written that she'd found a way to cover the rest of the honeymoon, that Whitney shouldn't worry about the cost of the resort, that she'd take care of it quietly. And then, further down, the line that Marcus had clearly been carrying around like a stone in his pocket for weeks. "Dana won't even notice. She's not the one who needs a big life right now." I read that sentence maybe 6 times. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, because I kept waiting for it to mean something different than it meant. And it never did. "Whitney doesn't fully know," Marcus said quietly, watching my face instead of his coffee now. "I don't think she ever asked where the money actually came from. Your mom told her it was fine, that it was handled, and Whitney spent her whole life being told not to ask too many questions about anything. So she didn't. I've known for weeks. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the reason the wedding fell apart. Some part of me kept hoping it would just resolve itself and I wouldn't have to be the one who broke it open." He looked down at his cup. "But I watched your family blame you for weeks over something you didn't even start, and I couldn't keep sitting on this. I want to tell you the money was the worst part of that message, but it wasn't. Not by then. The worst part was that single sentence, sitting there in a thread meant only for my sister's eyes. Not the one who needs a big life right now. Not a woman panicking about a wedding budget. A woman who had decided, in writing, months in advance, that I was simply a person things could be taken from, because I had never once been the daughter anyone expected to need anything for herself. I thanked Marcus. I meant it. And I told him so plainly, because I understood exactly what it had cost him to hand me that phone 3 weeks before he married into this family for good. I didn't ask him to testify to anyone or repeat any of it out loud. I told him this wasn't his fight to carry, and that whatever came next was between me and my mother, not between him and the woman he was about to marry. He nodded like he'd expected me to say that, and like some part of him was relieved I had. It meant he could go home and sit across the table from Whitney without a decision hanging over the rest of his evening. I drove home with both windows down, even though it wasn't warm enough for that, because I needed the noise of the road to fill the space where my thoughts kept trying to land. When I got inside, I didn't sit down. I went straight to the counter and picked up the envelope that had been sitting there for 2 weeks. For the first time, I opened it and read every line, all the way to the signature block at the bottom, where my name was still waiting. Unwritten. Exactly where she'd always assumed it would go. I read the renewal clause 3 times, checking whether it still meant what I thought it meant now that I actually wanted it to. It did. One signature kept the whole arrangement running another year, quiet and automatic, the same way a joint account runs quiet until somebody finally looks at it. I set the pen down without touching it to the paper. Not yet, I told myself, though some steadier part of me already knew what I was going to do. I called the bank the next morning, the one that held my mother's mortgage, not the branch where I worked. I knew the process well enough to walk myself through it without needing a single explanation. I asked for the correct department and told them plainly that I no longer intended to renew my guarantee on the loan. The woman on the phone was professional in the careful way people are when they suspect the call in front of them is about more than paperwork. She confirmed what I already knew from 6 years of unread fine print. Without a renewed guarantee, the borrower would have 30 days to requalify for the loan independently, based on her own income and credit. Miss that, and the loan would be reclassified into a higher risk tier, with a shorter runway before the bank moved to protect its position. I asked what I needed to submit in writing to make the non-renewal official. She sent the form within the hour. I filled it out at my kitchen table that same evening, in the plain, careful language I use every day for people whose lives are about to change because of a form exactly like it. Guarantor declines renewal. Reason guarantor no longer has sufficient confidence in the borrower's financial conduct to continue standing behind this obligation. I read that sentence back once before I signed it. It said exactly what needed saying and not one word more, which is its own kind of mercy, if you want to call it that. I mailed it the next morning and went to work like it was any other day, because for me that afternoon, it mostly was. I underwrote 2 auto loans and a small business line of credit before lunch. I have learned, in this job, that the biggest decisions in a person's financial life often look, from the outside, exactly like an ordinary Tuesday. It took 3 weeks for the letter to reach my mother. I know because Whitney told me, in a voice that had gone careful and flat. The same voice she'd used the day she asked me if there had been an agreement. The bank had written to inform Carol Kessler that her mortgage guarantor had declined renewal. She had 30 days to demonstrate independent qualifying income or provide an alternate guarantor. Fail that, and the loan would move to a variable structure the fixed income of a retired teacher's aide could never keep up with. There was no alternate guarantor waiting in the wings. The shape of what happened next told me everything about who could have stepped in and didn't. Nobody in that family had the kind of clean, steady income the bank was asking for, except the daughter who had just declined to give it. My mother called around, I heard later, to a cousin, to an old friend from church, to anyone she thought might carry the weight for her the way I always had. Nobody could, or nobody would. I never found out which. And by then I'd stopped needing to know, because the answer wouldn't have changed the 30 days sitting on that letter. Word moves fast in a town the size of Renwick, the way it always has. Somebody at Grace Community mentioned, over coffee after a Sunday service, that the Kessler place had a letter from the bank sitting on the counter. It was the kind of letter everyone in a small town somehow recognizes on sight, even from across a kitchen. My mother stopped answering calls from anyone who might ask about it directly. And then, the way she always had, she reached for the only tool she'd ever really trusted. Not an apology, a story. I heard, through the same cousin who tells me most things I'm not meant to hear, that she'd started telling people at church a different version entirely. One where her ungrateful older daughter had turned cold and vindictive out of nowhere, determined to punish a mother who had only ever tried to hold this family together. Nobody at that church knew about the joint account, or the 8 months of careful withdrawals, or a phone screen that had once read $100,000 and then read nothing at all. They only knew a version with a villain already cast in it, and I had apparently been given the part without an audition. It worked, for a little while, the way it always had. I found that out the hard way, standing at the gas station one afternoon while a woman I'd known since grade school looked straight through me and got into her car without a word. The rehearsal dinner was held at the same lodge hall where half the county's weddings happen. Long tables under strings of lights someone had spent an afternoon hanging. I almost didn't go. I told myself for 2 days that I had every right to skip it, that nobody could blame me for staying home the night before my sister's wedding, given everything. But Whitney had texted me herself that week. A short message with none of my mother's fingerprints on it. Please come. I need you there. I decided that was reason enough. I hadn't been seated 10 minutes before my mother rose from her chair at the head table, a glass in her hand, tapping it for quiet the way she does when she intends to perform rather than speak. The room settled the way rooms do for her, fast and obedient, servers pausing mid-step near the kitchen doors. She thanked everyone for coming, praised Whitney, praised Marcus's family. Then, without changing her tone at all, She pivoted into a version of the last 2 months that made my stomach go tight before she'd finished the first sentence. Her older daughter, she said, had let jealousy poison her heart, had turned her back on the family that raised her, right when her sister needed her most, over money that had always belonged to all of them anyway. A few relatives near the front nodded along, the way you nod at a story you've already been told once and decided to believe. Heads turned toward my end of the table. I felt the particular heat of being looked at by people who already believe they know the ending of your story. I didn't stand up. I didn't need to. Not yet. But Marcus did. He rose from beside Whitney, quiet as he'd been in every room I'd ever seen him in, and instead of raising his voice, he simply walked the length of the table to where she sat. He set his phone down in front of her. Screen lit. The same thread he'd shown me weeks earlier still open on it. He didn't say a word to the room. He didn't need to. Whitney looked down, and I watched her face change in real time. The way a face changes when it finally reads something it should have been shown months ago. Her hand went to her mouth for a second, then dropped, like she'd decided the moment didn't deserve to be softened by that gesture. "Is this real?" she asked him. Quiet at first, then louder, turned toward our mother now instead of him. "Mom." "Is this real? Did you know it was her whole savings account? Did you tell me it was fine to spend because you knew I'd never ask where it actually came from?" The hall went the particular kind of silent that isn't peaceful at all. My mother's glass hovered halfway back to the table. For the first time in my whole life, I watched her search for a story and not find one fast enough. "I did what I thought was right for this family," she finally said, and her voice had none of its usual polish in it. "Someone had to make the hard choices." "You've always had everything handed to you easily." "Dana," I thought just once. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone at that table had already heard the part that mattered, the part where she'd decided, out loud, in front of witnesses, that taking from me had simply been easier than asking anyone else, because I was the one who'd never once said no. An uncle near the far end set his fork down without eating another bite. Nobody at that table looked at her the way they'd looked at her 30 seconds earlier, and I don't think that ever fully came back for her. Not that night, and maybe not since. I stood up then, finally, not to shout, because that has never been how I do this. I looked at her. Not my mother in that moment, but a woman named Carol who had run out of a story to tell. And I said the only thing I had left to say. "You didn't make a hard choice," I told her. "You made an easy one. You just made it about me." I didn't wait for an answer because I understood, standing there, that there wasn't going to be one worth hearing. I set my napkin down on the table and thanked Whitney quietly for asking me to come. Then I walked out through the lodge's front doors into air that felt, for the first time in weeks, like it was entirely mine to breathe. The wedding happened anyway, the next afternoon, in the small white chapel off Main Street. I went. Whitney asked me to, and this time I believed her when she said it had nothing to do with our mother. I sat in the second row, not the first, and watched my sister marry a quiet man who had chosen honesty over comfort 3 weeks before. It would have been easier not to. My mother never found a replacement guarantor. Within a few months, she'd sold the house, the one my father had died to keep paid off. She moved into a smaller rented place near the edge of town, the kind with thin walls and a landlord instead of a mortgage. There was no dramatic collapse to it in the end, no courthouse steps, no crowd watching, just a moving truck on a quiet Saturday and a for sale sign that stayed up longer than anyone in that family wanted to admit, planted in a yard my father once mowed every week without being asked. She wrote me once, weeks later, a long message about family and forgiveness and letting go of the past for everyone's sake. I read it standing in my kitchen, in the apartment I still rent, though these days I'm saving towards something of my own instead of anyone else's. I didn't answer with anger. I wrote back a single line. Trust isn't a joint account you get to empty whenever you decide you need it more than I do. I never heard from her again after that. And for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like something I owed an explanation for. Whitney and I talk now, carefully, the way two people rebuild something that was never really theirs to begin with. Some Sundays she comes by with takeout, and we sit on my small balcony and don't mention our mother at all unless one of us brings it up first, which happens less and less as the months go on. Last month she asked me to teach her our father's chili recipe, the one he used to make every October. I stood in my kitchen and walked her through it step by step, the way he never got the chance to teach either of us himself. I still keep his old lunch pail on a shelf by my window, the dented metal one he carried to the foundry for 18 years. It's the one thing of his that was ever purely, plainly his, never shared, never borrowed, never anybody's business but the man who packed it every morning. I think about that a lot now. What it means for something to belong to exactly one person and nobody else. And how long it took me to want that for myself. Instead of feeling guilty for wanting it at all, I opened a new savings account not long after the wedding. It isn't $100,000. It doesn't need to be. What matters to me is that it has exactly one name on it. And for the first time in 23 years, that name is mine alone.